5 to 10 years, all originating from one NGO actually, which is interesting and pretty impressive in a certain sense. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk about what their idea was and how they pushed for it, and then how it has been realized in practice in the context of the wider Belgian penal culture, and where the difference is between the penal dreams and the penal realities. And as you will probably expect, there's a rather sizable difference between the two. And so that's what I'll be talking about. First, just a little, see if this thing works. Maybe it doesn't. Wait. Oh, there we go. First, a little bit on the history. The idea for this, the idea in Belgium for small-scale detention started with in 2008, where the concept was developed kind of more or less on a study day by Hans Claus, who's a former prison director, Christel Beyens, who's a criminologist, a rather well-known criminologist in Belgium. And a few months later, they were joined by an architect from the University of Ghent, Jonathan Meyer. And in that period between 2008 and 2012, they just worked on the idea of detention houses. They established an NGO, published a book where they sort of developed the concept, and then started pushing for the concept. They were all sort of relatively prominent societal figures, and they were very well connected, also in the world of media, and also, I would say, in the world of sort of celebrities. So they got a few celebrities to sort of back the concept. I think that did a lot for them. And they managed to get transition and detention houses, I'll explain the difference in a bit, enshrined in policy in 2016 in a coalition government, coalition agreement, and then in law in 2019. And in that same year of 2019, the movement went international. So they started a European movement called Rescaled. The Belgian movement is called De Huizen. When they started Rescaled, I do many things, as Keith told you, but I was also the first European coordinator of Rescaled. So I set it up together with Helene de Vos, who is still the European coordinator. I didn't leave because I disagreed or because there were problems. I just left because I had another job. That was actually a very good experience. So we launched that movement, and that's still very much alive and kicking. And I think they have come to Ireland and recently as well. And that's why I think this is also a relevant subject. And during that same period in 2019, the first transition houses, and in 2022, the first detention houses were realized in Belgium. I'll already say it. I'll say more about transition houses and detention houses later, but transition houses are a specific modality of sentence execution that they're small-scale facilities that people can apply for when they're 18 months away from their parole date or their conditional release date, kind of like halfway houses, you could say. Detention houses, that's a more complicated situation because that's something that the way the prison service sort of co-opted the idea of small-scale detention, but I will come back to that later. They're two different things, but detention houses are for people with short sentences. So there's basically now small-scale detention in Belgium is for two categories: people towards the end of their sentence and people with short sentences. All right. So what is the big idea, or the small idea maybe, of small-scale detention? The big idea is that you need to organize detention in facilities that are small-scale, which in the history of the organization has meant different things, but generally I think the consensus is that that's between, like, let's say 8 and 30 people, 30 being absolute tops, which I already think that's sort of tops, but that's the idea. That's in all the communications. It's between 8 and 30 people because that's considered sort of a workable sort of size, but in my experience, the movement has also been careful not to distance themselves from initiatives or places that have a larger capacity, but that work, for instance, with just smaller scale living groups within a larger facility. The concept isn't, the original idea was to just have houses, right? And no big facilities with small living groups, but just houses. But of course there's, again, penal realities that you also have to take into account, and that is, I think, the reason why they're also trying to accommodate for these sorts of more small scale units within larger facilities. So that's one thing, small scale. The other thing is differentiated, the idea being that you have different houses for people with different needs. It's a very simple idea. Differentiation, I think, especially in the early stages of sort of the rollout of this kind of idea, is of course very difficult to achieve because there's just very few detention houses. So you are not going to have detention houses tailored to people's needs, but you are going to select people from prisons that fit what the detention house has to offer, which is a very different process. But I will come back to that later. So that's the second part of the concept. And the third idea is community integration. So the idea, which basically means the houses should be sort of not on some faraway parking lot or whatever, but within a community, within a city, use service providers that are used in the community. Either people go there themselves or they come in, depending on sort of the, well, all the modalities that they can use or apply for. And also ideally provide some kind of community function, right? Which can just be like, I don't know, cleaning up the street or offering some kind of service to the community. So that's the idea, that's the concept. Now this is, I think, interesting, this concept is integrated within what you could call a penal vision or a penal paradigm, sort of an idea about, well, where the criminal justice system should be going. And right from the start, they have been very emphatic, especially the Dutch NGO, the Dutch-speaking, the Flemish NGO, the Dutch-speaking NGO, the Huizen, that they advocate for a penal paradigm whereby prisons are replaced with detention houses. So that is the idea. From the start, they've been wary of creating extra capacity. So the idea has been, what we want to do is the stated goal has been to replace all large-scale prisons with small-scale detention facilities. That's the idea. That's the idea for sort of the Dutch NGO, and with rescale, so the European variant, that's become a little bit less explicit. I don't know necessarily if they would not agree with that vision or that ambition, but it's just less explicit in their communication. So they say we support the use of detention houses instead of large prison institutions. This is from their mission statement, right? So I'm not making this up. And it's important to note, and I will come back to this, that this idea, both for rescaled and for the Huizen, is rooted in a kind of vision or dream of major societal change towards more just, safe, inclusive societies, which are both presented as something desirable and as a shift that is already happening. So it's a little bit ambiguous. They're saying both things in their communication. And the idea is that detention houses are both part of that societal shift towards a more just and durable and inclusive society, but are also a driver of that shift, right? So a new concept of detention can also be part of a much needed shift in the direction of our criminal justice systems. That's sort of what they, that's sort of the position, that's the big idea. So what has that resulted in practice? Well, transition houses and detention houses. So there are currently 4 transition houses of 15 places each in 4 different places in Leuven. A 5th one is scheduled to open recently, soon, spring of 2025, so that should be about now. And that's it for now. So the idea was first that there would be 150 places. Given inflation and all sorts of budgetary constraints, it's now going to be 75 places. In total, they might be extended in the future, but there's no concrete plans. So the idea is, as I explained, that people from 18 months before their eligibility for conditional release, which is in Belgium usually 1/3 of their sentence, so that in theory could go there. In practice, they are usually much closer to their conditional release date or far over their conditional release date. So that's just a theoretical sort of concern. It has very little bearing on practice. There are also constraints in the sense that you cannot have an acute drug problem, an acute mental health issue. Sexual or terrorist convictions are also excluded on principle. And as you can see, it's important to note that these are not run by the prison system. So they are strictly speaking also not prisons. They are modalities for the execution of sentences, like electronic monitoring, for instance. And they can be run basically by anyone who has a convincing story. In the concrete case, that means security companies. So 2 are run by G4S, 1 is run by Serco. which I think is also a big prison entrepreneur in the UK, if I'm not mistaken. And one is run by an NGO. So the idea is basically that you apply, there's sort of like a, I don't know what you call that, but the state just basically says, well, you can apply, and then people can apply with the plan, and they get money to run it. So that's what's currently the situation. The fifth one that's coming is also run by that same NGO, that the Kansenfabriek, the Opportunity Factory is what that means in Dutch, which also has the transition house in Leuven. Thanks. And then detention houses, this is interesting because both in the terminology of rescaled and in the terminology of the Huizen, the idea is that they advocate for detention houses. Now the Belgian government sort of, in what I consider to be sort of a move of co-optation, enshrined detention houses in law, but then made something out of it that has very little to do with the original concept of detention houses as it is still being advocated by rescaled in the Huizen, which causes, in the Belgian context, an enormous amount of confusion. You cannot explain it to people anymore, but still. So there are currently 2 detention houses. They are prisons. They are enshrined within the Prison Act, and they are run by the Belgian Prison Service. There is one in Kortrijk. That's the picture you see here. It's basically an old people's home. There are 77 places, and there's one in Vorst, which has 57 places, and interestingly, the detention house in Vorst used to be the women's prison of Vorst. So it's the same building, it's just new furniture, and slightly lower sort of security measures. So that just already goes to show that it's currently with these detention houses in Belgium, it's very difficult to tell why something is a detention house and why something is a prison, right? Because the detention house of Kortrijk has 77 places, but the prison of Dinant in Wallonia has 52 places. But the one with the 52 places is a prison and the other one is a detention house, right? So it gets murky. It gets murky. Currently, there are agreements with I think a Dutch contractor for another 280 places in detention houses. Some of these will be, the idea is that they will be smaller, so it's 40 places maximum. For a total of 280 places, these will mostly be what they call modular constructions. So it's difficult to find sites, so they're going to build sites. I don't know, it's definitely not like containers, but it will be something relatively nice. It's part of a much larger deal with that same contractor to create 1,100 places, so 280 places for small-scale detention, and the rest, so that's like 820 places for the detention of illegal, foreigners without right of residence in Belgium who've committed a crime, right? So it's part of a bigger picture, so to speak. The idea was that they would be for people with short sentences. Now, short sentences in Belgium is everything under 3 years, which is nuts. Nowhere in the world is 3 years considered a short sentence, but it is in Belgium. For many, many years, because of prison overcrowding, sentences under 3 years were not executed in Belgium. They were automatically executed under electronic monitoring. This was a situation that led to a lot of frustration with judges, because they thought, well, I mean, if I sentence you to a prison sentence, then, and if it's 3 years, it's also serious sometimes. So, I mean, if I sentence you to a prison sentence, I want you to go to prison. So there was a lot of frustration there, so the Minister of Justice decided to have them executed, these prison sentences. So they are now being executed, prison sentences under 3 years, but the idea was we'll do it in detention houses. I'll come back to that later. What I can say now is that because of a lack of what they call right profiles to go to the detention house, they are extending the category of people that can go to the detention house to people who have sentences up to 5 years. Okay, thanks. So that was for these innovations. Now for the broader context, because I think that's important to know. And I want to focus on 2 aspects of sort of the broader Belgian penal context. First, its repressive nature, just briefly, and secondly, the problem of overcrowding. And I'm talking about Belgium, and then you can see what trends are present in Ireland and which aren't. But I mean, I think it's fair to say that Belgium has a pretty repressive penal culture. We have a 1,500% increase in the number of prison sentences of over 3 years since the 1970s. So that's a significant rise. And we both have a new penal code and a new coalition agreement that are both unpromising, or unpromising from my point of view, namely it's going to be harsher, it's going to be longer, there's going to be much more combinations of prison sentences with all sorts of indeterminate measures that can extend control. That's the idea. And then there's also a coalition agreement that really wants to be tough on crime, which contains, among other things, the measure to increase parole eligibility thresholds from 1/3 to 3/5 for sexual delinquents, 3/4 for recidivists. So 1/3 is a very low, obviously a very low threshold for parole eligibility, but that also means that sentences in Belgium are very high. If you look at actual sentence length, sort of in Belgian prisons across, it's actually sort of comparable to everywhere. So, but in order to get to that actual sentence length, you have to actually have a pretty high sentence, right? If you want to make sure someone's 8 years in prison, you have to give them 24, and that's also how judges think. So that's one part of the penal landscape, and the other one is prison overcrowding. I know it's a problem here in Ireland too. In Belgium, it's been a problem since the 1980s. One of the things I just talked about, namely the not executing sentences under 3 years, that was a measure designed to counter overcrowding. It's a huge problem still, even though there has been a recent increase in capacity, a very significant increase in capacity. So in the last 2 or 3 years, they created an additional 1,500 places, which have not done anything to reduce overcrowding, because as you all know, if you create capacity, it's going to get filled. That's one serious problem of overcrowding. The other serious problem that has to do with overcrowding is the fact that we have about 1,000 people who are judged not guilty by reason of insanity under hospital orders, for whom there is no place in forensic psychiatric facilities, so who are also staying in prison. Again, despite a capacity boost of about 450 places in recent years. So that's the bigger penal landscape: repressive policies and serious prison overcrowding. And so that's the context in which this idea of small-scale detention is being introduced. This is just the graph for the prison population and the practical capacity. And as you can see, the trend of the population, that's the blue line, neatly follows the capacity trend, but they never get closer to one another. Except with the little dip during COVID, right? That's probably, I guess this is how it looks everywhere, more or less. Yeah. So, what are the issues, I think? What are the issues given the introduction of small-scale detention within this sort of penal landscape? I think there are 4. Wait, let me just list them. Oh, sorry, I'll So it's sugarcoating, it's net-widening, it's cherry-picking, and it's privatizing. Those are the 4 issues, I think, that we get with this introduction, or 4 things that in Belgium have been the practical result of this idea, and that I don't think need in any way to be the result of introducing small-scale detention. No one in Belgium obviously wanted that, or no one of the Huizen or of Reskilled wanted that to happen, but it has happened. So I think that's why it's important to talk about it, because if it's coming to Ireland, these are the things that are, I don't know, the Irish context is different, but these similar issues might accrue, and it's good to be aware of them, right? Yeah. So first, there's a kind of a sugarcoating dynamic to the whole small-scale detention reality, and it goes in different ways. There's 2 aspects I want to highlight. One is that, and I'll come back to that later, it gets an enormous amount of attention. That is because of the very successful advocacy of those NGOs. But the result is that it gets so much attention that the rest of the prison system sort of gets forgotten in sort of coverage, right? So for instance, there was a very successful TV series of a rather sort of, let's say, entertainment-focused TV network called VTM, The Detention House, which of course presents a very sort of nice and benign face to the detention house, which is all good, and maybe it's a good place to be in certain senses. I'm sure of that. But people start thinking of the Belgian criminal justice system from that lens, right? So, whereas it's actually highly overcrowded, 3 people in a cell sort of, like reality. So that's one part. The other more concrete part of what I call sugarcoating is the way it was used to affect the execution of sentences under 3 years, right? So the idea was that these sentences needed to be executed, and the argument was by the Minister of Justice to convince a lot of academics and people in the field, well, we are going to execute these short sentences, but don't worry, we'll execute them in detention houses, and we won't execute them in prisons. That's the idea. So you have the bitter pill of the execution of short sentences, and you have the nice coat of sugar of executing it in detention houses. But in reality, there are currently 114 people in detention houses, and there are a total of 1,844 people with short sentences in prison, right? So what you get, and this is of course what everybody knew was going to happen, is that a very small, under 10% of those people with short sentences get sent to detention houses, and the rest is just in prisons, right? So that's a problem. The other problem with the detention houses is this sort of the capacity question, right? Is it still a detention house if you have 77 people, or have you just found a nicer term for what is in actuality just a small prison, right? And maybe small prisons are better than big prisons, but maybe it's a little bit kind of a sugar-coating sort of mechanism to call those small prisons detention houses and pretend like you've developed something quite new and revolutionary, right? This was the former Minister of Justice, who Vincent van Quickenborne, who had the short sentences executed, and he said that by 2050, 80% of prison sentences in Belgium must be executed in some type of small-scale detention, right? And I think that's another way in which this sort of, this repressive landscape sugarcoats itself by saying, well, don't worry, we know there's problems, but by 2050, 80% of sentences is going to be executed in some type of small-scale detention. And the Huizen, so the NGO advocating for small-scale detention, continues to reiterate this citation as if it were government policy. But can you go to the next one? If you look at the actual development of the prison population between 2019 and 2025, the picture doesn't really look like the 80% mark is going to be met in 2050. So this was the prison population in 2019. This is every single person is 100 people, basically, right? So between 2019 and 2025, the guys in blue are the prisoners that is the increase of the prison population. So it was an increase of about 3,000. And the guys in red are the people who, of that entire population, went into a small-scale form of detention, right? So let's say, give or take, about 180. So that's the situation. Yeah. So what the Minister of Justice wants is this, right? So, or what they are advocating for is this: 80% of the prison population is small-scale detention. The question obviously is, how is that ever going to happen? If the current population is, if the current trend is that you get, for every single person you get into small-scale detention, you get another, 10 people in ordinary prison. How is that going to work, right? So that's the sugarcoating sort of problem. Then secondly, and this might be a specific Belgian issue, I don't know, is the net-widening issue, right? This, for me personally, has always been an issue. Even also when I worked for the organization, the question was, well, okay, it's one thing to create a small-scale form of detention, but how are we ever going to ensure that they are going to replace capacity instead of just increase capacity, right? So for a while, we sort of promoted the idea of replacing like a single prison, like a smaller prison in one particular city with this couple of detention houses to sort of do it that way. But it is a serious question. It's also a serious problem, because if you look at other measures that have been taken to reduce prison overcrowding in Belgium, or you see that they have had, actually incredible net-widening effects. For example, electronic monitoring has been in use in Belgium since 2000. The explicit goal was to reduce prison overcrowding, but the outcome was, as we have seen, that the prison population has increased, And there are also currently about 5,000 people under electronic monitoring in Belgium, right? So there's more than 11,000 new tags placed in Belgium every year. The same problem arose with capacity creation in forensic psychiatric units. The idea was we have a long-standing problem of people with hospital orders being in the prison. So the idea was we create forensic psychiatric capacity, both outside of the prison, both in specific institutions and in regular psychiatries. And then we will solve that problem. But what happened, for some weird reason in actuality, is that about 1,000 people with hospital orders left the prison to these forensic psychiatric establishments, and 1,000 new ones entered the prison system. Right? So the net result has been that we still have 1,000 people with hospital orders in prison, but now we also have 1,000 people with hospital orders outside of prison. So again, it's just net widening. Currently, not a single sort of prison place has been replaced by a small-scale form of detention. So the important question, I think, also for the Belgian advocates is how are we going to ensure that happens? That we're not just creating an additional modality like electronic monitoring, just some additional form of capacity, right? That's the question. The third problem is, well, it's kind of obvious that if you don't have a large number of detention houses, you can't really differentiate. So what you're going to do is you're going to pick people from the prison system that are easy to work with, right? That is both formal, so no acute drug problems, things I talked about, no sexual terrorist convictions, no serious mental health problems, but it's also informal. Because you have a big pool of people to choose from, you see in practice that the people that are chosen are people that are agreeable, not too difficult to work with, have good prospects of rehabilitation or reintegration, etc., etc. That's just what's bound to happen, and I think that is very much confirmed by the move now to up the level for entry into detention houses to sentences under 5 years, right? So what we currently see is we have, again, as I said, about 120 people in small-scale detention. Of the 1,800 people with sentences up to 3 years, they are now going to create more capacity in the detention houses, but they already have a problem filling those detention houses because they can't find enough suitable candidates. So what happens is that they now include the category of people with sentences up to 5 years. So that's another 1,800 people. So you get to a total of 3,600 people for about 400 places in small-scale detention. So it seems, based off of that sort of those sorts of numbers, that you get to maybe to like a 1 in 10 ratio, where one out of every 10 prisoners will be found suitable for insertion in one of these small-scale facilities, which again is probably very good for those 1 in 10 people, but far from the vision of replacing prisons. So that's one thing, and the other thing that happens a lot is what I call leeching, which is not a very nice term, I realize, but it is sort of true that these small-scale facilities are parasitic upon larger institutions in two ways. Namely, they filter the easy prisoners out of the large prisons, which is not so great for the living climate in those larger prisons. And of course, they continually send difficult prisoners back if they somehow don't function very well in the small-scale facility. I realized only yesterday, accidentally, I was reading a little bit about the penal colony of Maitret, which Foucault writes a lot about in Discipline and Punish in the 1840s, and I realized they had the exact same thing actually. So if you were sent to Maitret and you failed there, you were also just sent back to a normal prison. And of course we still do that, right? You get to a nicer facility with more freedoms, and if you somehow don't function there in the desired way, you get sent back to the prison. And it's also, because for that reason, obviously also used very strongly as a disciplining tool within these small-scale facilities. So people just get told, well, if you don't like it here, you can always go back to prison. Which, yeah, that's just sort of what happens. So they are, again, like the question is, how can you, if you create such institutions, how can you ensure that they don't become parasitic upon a dysfunctional prison system. That's not just the case for this, it's also the case for Norway, for instance, where also there are quite a lot of nicer, small-scale facilities, but there's also a lot of nasty prisons that people just get sent back to if they don't function in the nice places. And then finally, and I'll be brief about this, it has introduced privatization in the Belgian prison system. It didn't exist in the Belgian prison system, but the transition houses are privately run. Yeah, that's a whole other discussion, but yeah, the question is how desirable is that? And I would say that the problematic thing about it in this particular case is that it has been done without any public discussion about it, right? Because they're not officially prisons. It's just they just sort of did it, and then because it was such a nice concept and people were for the concept, people didn't really bother about asking who was actually going to run it. The other problem, and this is a bigger problem I think, is because they are privately run and they are not technically prisons, transition houses are not subject to the Belgian Prison Act, which means that there is no monitoring whatsoever. There's no oversight or monitoring whatsoever. There's no bodies except sort of general bodies that have legal rights to. Monitoring in Belgium is actually it's pretty well organized. For the prisons, it's a completely separate organ which has a lot of rights. It's directly under the parliament. It's not part of the Ministry of Justice. They can say whatever they can say and sort of do say whatever they want. So it's well organized in Belgium, generally speaking. But these transition houses are not part of it. All right. So when I say these things, I get often two responses from people sympathetic to small-scale detention, which I actually am myself, but the two responses are these two, namely one is a pragmatic response, which says it is still better to be in a detention house than in a prison. I think that is most of the time true, not always, but most of the time that's true. But the question that should be asked in view of the net-widening problem is it also still better than to just be out? Or to be out under electronic monitoring, or to be out under some kind of conditional release or parole, right? And that's a question that gets asked less. That's one response, sort of the pragmatic response. The other response is what I would call the visionary response, which is what I get a lot in Belgium, not so much from the European sort of movement, or maybe not even at all, but in Belgium, where they have really focused very hard on realizing these detention houses. And so I understand the response as well. They say, well, but you have to see it within the bigger picture of the big societal change that is going to come. So these problems are just sacrifices that we have to make on the road to the complete overhaul of the system, which is going to come at some point in the future, and these are just acceptable. You cannot expect to implement this sort of facility or to facilitate that kind of societal transition without having to make these sacrifices. Well, that might be true, but the question, of course, is what makes you so sure that this overhaul is going to happen? That's one. And two, how many sacrifices are you willing to make? So now, I'm not saying that this all applies to Ireland, because I don't know, right? You guys know. For one, I don't know whether the net-widening challenge will be such a big challenge in Ireland. Electronic monitoring didn't really take off in Ireland. As far as that's a question, right? So I don't know, but I think at least co-optation is always a serious risk. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know how it's going to go down here, but I'm sure it cannot be otherwise than that it will be co-opted in some sense. So it's important to think about how that might happen. And my advice would be, which is unsolicited, but I'm still going to give it. I think it is crucial to make a hard distinction between what we want as penal change and what we think is actually going to happen, right? So between sort of our desires and what we actually predict will happen. I see in Belgium at least that there's a lot of confusing of the two, and I understand that. I understand it from an activist point of view. If the whole day all you do is you are invited to come and talk about small-scale detention, and you go to all sorts of places, and you talk about small-scale detention, and everybody's very happy when they hear it, you start to think that society is actually changing. That is very understandable from your sort of first-person perspective. That's what happens with all sort of activism. But it's important to also sort of be able to take a step back and sort of look at numbers and sort of the bigger sort of penal landscape to see how these, that's the second bit of advice, what we actually think are the most probable scenarios for how the penal landscape will change if small-scale detention is introduced, right? That's just something that I think people who advocate for small-scale detention or sympathetic to it should think about like where is it going to be put on sort of the whole penal map, and what are sort of the risks if it gets put where it's put. That's and then one more thing, just a small thing, but an important thing, I think. Whenever something new happens in the criminal justice landscape, it gets a lot of attention, and so does small-scale detention. It gets an enormous share, in Belgium it gets an enormous share of media attention, but also activist attention, practitioner attention, and criminological attention, which is very understandable because people are just very happy that something new is happening, something that's just more promising than just the same sort of overcrowded old max security prisons that we have. It's all very understandable. But I would say it gets about 90% of attention, but it is a phenomenon that affects only a marginal number of prisoners, right? So about 1 in 65 prisoners ever have to do with, in their sort of careers, come across some form of small-scale detention. So the plight of people not in that situation gets overlooked very often. And again, that might be something that is necessary if you want to sort of push for a certain change for a while. You might need to ignore other things to just focus on that, right? Especially if you sort of believe in, well, the vision, I would say, or the dream of sort of that sort of societal shift towards small-scale detention. But if you don't believe in that, then you might sort of need to think twice about where sort of, how to sort of navigate those activist sort of energies, right? Whether you want to combine advocating for small-scale detention also with other sort of more abolitionist or reductionist sort of approaches.